Wait a minute, we have to do the pencil sharpening. All right, so let's just change this to, all right, we'll just talk about dry sump. Not so much operation, but the dry sump engine. Dry sump engine. All right, we talked last week about the fact that a dry sump engine is an engine that really, it's distinguished between a wet sump, that a wet sump, all of the oil is just down below the engine in the sump, right, in the oil sump. And a dry sump, it's still there. You still have a sump, but you have a scavenge pump that scavenges all the oil out of it and sends it to a tank that is located usually on the firewall, a remote one. So the majority of the oil is not there underneath the engine. And we talked about reasons why we do this. Number one, it could be a radial, what's on the bottom of a radial? Cylinders, right? That'd be a bad place to put a sump then. So you have cylinders right there, or like the V-tail Bonanza, which had, or some engines, landing gear comes up next to it or something like that. Yeah, so we got that. So let me see, what about the oil tank? So dry sump engine, we'll just do this. Oil tank. Uh-oh, where's Janet?
She was feeling sick.
Oh. Oil tank is mounted. What's that?
Now you're going to be writing hello fast.
I know, because you can just pause it. You can pause it, right, Janet? She's like, oh, yeah, I can. All right, oil tank is mounted on the firewall. Of course, you can have one for each engine. It's not just one big oil tank that goes out to multiple engines. That would be a huge mistake to do that, wouldn't it? Why would it be a huge mistake if I had a twin-engine aircraft and said, like a radial, like a, anybody know, is that a Lockheed Electra or is that a Beech 18?
It's a Beech 18.
Is it? How can you tell? You have me going too. Really? Why?
All I know is that confidence is key.
I know it is, man. I'm telling you, confident. Well, okay, well, Julie's good. So either way, it's why would I not just, for the sake of simplicity, just put one big oil tank right up front?
You lose both engines.
Yeah.
No point of failure. Lost the oil.
If you lost the oil, you would
Lose both engines.
lose both engines. Okay, I like that one. That's good too. What else?
It does not seem very effective to put it all the way up at the nose and have the engine on the wings.
Okay, I like that too. It doesn't make sense to pump it all the way down, across, and over. Any time you'd have a problem with an oil line, then you could lose all the oil for both engines, and then, well, you would fly all the way to the crash site. And then the other thing I was thinking is, what if you had one engine was going out? You're seizing up a bearing in it, and you're making massive amounts of metal. And that metal goes to the oil tank, and that oil goes to the other one. So you want to keep them totally separate. By the way, I watched a really good documentary this I think it's this weekend. Yeah, about Search for Amelia Earhart. I thought it was going to be stupid, but it was really good. I really liked it. All right.
Was it on Hulu or no?
Oh no, we have Disney Plus now too. I
That's where it was.
think it was Disney Plus. It was a National Geographic thing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I paid for that too.
All right, so the outlet
Oh yeah.
is, I think if you have Verizon, you get Disney Plus free for 1 year.
I think that's only if you have unlimited data, the unlimited data plan.
No, it's only on Yacon. Or here?
Outlet is at or near the lowest, L-O-W-E, lowest point. Well, if I have an oil tank, this be my oil tank, and of course we've got to have an outlet, it might make sense. P-O-I, point. It might make sense to have the outlet right here. Would it not? Versus somewhere like this. Because if it was up here and the oil level got down to here, we'd still have oil, right? If it was here, that would not work. So we can't have it there. That would be bad. So the oil is at or near the lowest point. Well, it's not always at the lowest point, believe it or not. Some of them actually have a little pipe. This is called a, I should use black, stand pipe. This is called a stand pipe. Little thing, stand pipe, S-T-A-N, stand pipe. Stand pipe. So that in fact, when the engine sucks all the oil, out, like let's say we had some sort of problem with the engine and it was blowing oil everywhere, burning it up, it would actually get all the way down to the bottom and leave a little bit of oil left in it. And the engine would run dry, but it'd leave a little bit of oil. Anybody care to guess why in the world they'd want to do that?
For the contaminated, the metal shavings and stuff that settle at the bottom. That was mine.
That was a pretty good thought, actually. I like that, except remember the theory. It's better to have really, really bad oil than no oil. Because at that point, you wouldn't really want to be thinking, well, the engine's destroying itself. Better not give us some bad oil, too. It'll really make it bad. This is kind of an obscure thought here. But you got to start thinking about this stuff, the entire system. So what drives the propeller, constant speed propeller on engines? I've mentioned this. Engine oil is what changes the pitch. Now, if I have a twin engine aircraft, and I got one engine that's just about ready to launch itself, it's going to have a dynamic disassembly any minute, it's seizing up. What I want is that propeller to feather. And I want the blades to go so that they both go into the wind, and so it stops windmilling. Because if I got an engine that's seizing and the blades are set such that the wind now starts driving the engine and it seizes, when it does stop, or even before it does, you're creating a lot of drag. So when I turn that engine off, I want the blades to be rotated so that they're aimed right into the wind and they will come to a stop. And just like little wings sitting there now. And so there's nothing. But what drives that those propellers to feather in some aircraft is it has a secondary pump in it, so it would have another outlet to it. This would be specifically for the Hamilton standard, actually, type. It's going to go to another pump that goes to the prop. So prop feather pump. So it needs just enough oil to run the feather pump. And so what it does, it's got a secondary pump that is going to, you can act the feathering pump. So it's going to run the pump. We'll talk about this next class. And it needs that oil to drive the propeller to feather. And so you want to save just enough for that to happen. So, but not all aircraft. Most twins are designed that if they lose oil pressure, they automatically go to feather, which would be a much better idea, right? Okay. So the outlet at near the lowest point. This we talked about a second outlet. Second outlet, where am I? Below the normal outlet. The normal outlet. Maybe, let me see, may be provided for the feathering pump. We'll just say that for the prop, feathering pump. That's enough about that.
So, and then is there a different plug to drain that? Some?
No, you can put a plug right here. This is the outlet plug. It would just then you put the outlet plug all the way at the bottom.
Okay.
All right, let me see what else we got here. A, B, C, we'll make this D then. Some aircraft. And this would typically be radials with a large oil supply. They are going to have something called a hopper. Use a hopper. Or often called, or I'd call it a hopper, temperature accelerating well. And when I talk about large quantities of oil, like I said, one of the smallest radial engines out there is the Continental 220 on a Stearman. There's obviously much smaller ones, but that's just like the common smallest one, 7-cylinder radial. That one uses 6 gallons on the Stearman. So do an oil change is 24 quarts. That's a lot of oil. So the hopper contains 6 gallons of oil. And it takes a long time to warm up 6 gallons of oil, especially if you're in a cold climate. So rather than having to heat up all of this oil, what they have is a temperature accelerating well, which would basically look like some sort of, so we can put like a can in here. We'll leave it open on the top. Well, we'll put holes in it. That's what we'll do. So with a lot of little holes in it, so oil is free to move about in and out of the can. But if you put if I took a coffee can or even my water, don't do it to mine, and I drilled a bunch of holes in it, right? And so then what I did is I had the oil return line coming in and going down into here. All the oil fills this up, and that's hot oil, and the hot oil goes this way. And so I'm using a very small quantity of oil in that hopper, but yet since there's holes all over the place, as the oil starts to warm up this can, it's going to warm up the oil around it, and that's going to allow the oil to come inside these little holes and join its friends, and pretty soon, you know, the whole tank is at the same temperature. But in the meantime, the hot oil comes back in the hopper and it sucks it out of the hopper.
It's not what it's called, the jacket, right? The jacket is different.
It is actually different because the jacket goes on an oil cooler. That's a terrible looking drawing. I messed it all up. Anyway. So temperature accelerating well. Let's see. I could add some points to that. Let's see. We could add that I said that, well, a Stearman, S-T-E-A-R-M-A-N, Stearman, with W670 holds 6 gallons of oil. And there, that's a small radial. Let's see. So a hopper is a well within the oil tank. Within the oil tank that allows hopper is a well within the tank that allows a smaller amount of oil, to be used, I hope this works out, to be used in the engine warm-up during engine warm-up. How's that work for you? If you don't like it, you can change your wording. Because you want your oil at temperature before you take off and start flying, especially in these air-cooled engines. But you know what? It takes a long time for the oil temperature to come up. My little airplane only holds 6 quarts, and it takes seemingly forever before the needle starts coming up. And so can you imagine how long you have to sit there at the end of the runway in Alaska waiting for 6 gallons to warm up? Or heaven forbid it's a much larger aircraft and you're waiting for 8 or 12 gallons for this thing to warm up. It takes forever. So
Do they have tank heaters?
not that I've ever seen. Well, I don't want to say no. Okay, yes. You can buy I know you can buy aftermarket heaters. It's just like, well, I was going to say it's like a waterbed heater blanket. It looks just like that, but you guys never had a waterbed. I did. That's how I set my house on fire. That's a whole other story I'm not going to tell. So,
Well, I've seen them. They're like magnetic, and they wrap around.
yeah. And they plug into the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to have a long extension cord.
Or you can wire them in.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. I was going to put the something. Let me see. The warm oil. How about that? The warm oil. Then warms. The remaining oil. There we go. And I don't think I need to go on from that, but the oil coming in then has within the little hopper. It wants to stay in there. It's warm, and it warms up the oil surrounding it, and that oil then kind of comes into little holes, and then the whole thing works as one big tank that is working. All right, let's do required items. Required. Was that 13? I don't remember. Yes, 13. Required items, according to FAR 23-1013. So FAR 23 has changed quite a bit. I really don't want to get into this too much. So some of these, even references that I'm pulling out of that FAR, especially 23, they have changed. And what happened is, for the longest time, everything was just written down in the FARs. And now we're getting into a whole different set of how aircraft are made. So, for example, it used to be you want to make an aircraft, it's kind of like you'd open up FAR 23, okay, we got to have this, and we got to have that, got to have this, because it says so right here in FAR 23. And then there became this change where, I want to say SAE, they're using SAE standards, but that's not right. I forget. They're using a whole different set of standards, whereby now you can make an aircraft, and as long as you can prove to the FAA when you make it that it meets safety requirements that they've set up, it's good to go, and you don't have to follow all these requirements. And so I probably need to update this, start pulling some stuff out. But a lot of aircraft were made under Part 23, and they were required to have certain things when they did it. And as far as I can tell, the FAA Q&As have never acknowledged this fact. They'll still throw in things like, what must you have, like the things I'm going to talk about now. And you still have to know this, even though you may look it up in FAR 23 and go, it doesn't even exist anymore. They maybe pulled out 1013. And so it gets confusing, but just know that's why it is. It's not that I'm necessarily, well, not that I'm wrong, but you'll say, well, I can't find 23.1013. That may be a bad example, but it might be a good one too. Just know that we're going back in time a little bit, and some of the FAA questions haven't caught up to the new standards, so you have to know this kind of stuff, what used to be. So I think this is an actual Q&A right now. So what, according to FAR 23.103, what are the things that you must have in the oil system? What must it have? Well, one of them, you must have this expansion space. So the tank must have an expansion space, must have an expansion space. Well, what's an expansion space? There you go, for the oil to expand. Well, was it going to expand? Temperature change, it's going to grow. Foaming, there we go. Gets all foamy. You get air inside there, it's going to foam, it's going to expand. You don't want it pouring out all over the place. Number one, it's a fire hazard. Number two, they're environmental, we don't care, right? But you want to have this expansion space so when it foams, and you still have a place to store it. So how much our expansion space? Of 10% or 1/2 gallon, whichever is more. And for some reason I felt the need to put this expansion space, an expansion space must be protected from overfilling, must be protected from overfilling by use of a neck into the tank, which is to say that the top of the tank, grab the tank, and here's the filler. By the way, the filler is almost always yellow. Have the cap. You can't just fill it all the way to the top and go, well, there it is, it's full. There's going to be a neck that comes down like this so that the oil is going to be full to right here. And this is the expansion space up here. Otherwise, you get in the situation I had in my last car, where the nice folks, and I brought in oil to have them change my oil since they were working on my tires anyway, and they said they could do it. And I had 2 cases of oil in my trunk, and when I got home, I said, "Where's my 2 cases?" And they said, "We put it into the car." Why would you put 2 cases of oil into a guy's car? Because we couldn't find the dipstick. Well, I was sitting right there. Why didn't you ask me where the dipstick was? I would have gladly pointed it out. What's that?
It's one of those BMWs that don't have it.
It was a Mercedes that didn't have it. It was the steering wheel. You just pulled up the menu.
That is so stupid.
Yep.
I don't understand.
What's stupid? Not having a dipstick, or the people who just poured everything into the car
Both.
because it was there?
Pretty much both, yeah.
Okay. We have 2. 2. It must have a vent. Must have a vent. So let's see. Each oil tank. Well, I don't want to get all wordy, and I do want to spell right though. Each oil tank must be. We'll try and bring this down. Must be vented. Vented to the engine. To the engine. From the top part of the expansion space, which of course that makes sense. Each tank must be vented to the engine. That's good enough. What else? Oil tank vents must be protected from freezing. That would be bad. Oil tank vents must be arranged so that condensed water vapor that might freeze and obstruct the line cannot accumulate at any point. So we want to protect from freezing. And for aerobatic planes, aerobatic planes, must be a means to prevent hazardous oil loss during aerobatic maneuvers, including short periods of inverted flight. So for aerobatic planes, there must be a means to prevent hazardous oil loss.
So it's fine if it loses a little bit.
That's why I put the hazard word there. Guess you can lose a little bit. What's hazardous? Well, you.
A lot.
Whatever makes the plane inoperable.
That's right. 3. I used to have a cap. Must have an oil cap. Oil cap with the words. What are the words going to be?
Oil.
Well, that's word.
Oil cap. Oil.
Oil. The words oil. Also, the grade. What does grade mean?
Wait.
Yeah, what kind of weight should go in there? Grade or reference. Like oil per the pilot operating handbook. I wrote this. And should have capacity. But not required.
So you could either have oil or grade or reference.
Must have the words oil and a grade or reference. So like oil, 20W50, or oil. Actually, my aircraft, when you open up the little oil door, there's a little sticker right there that says oil on the cap, and it has the quantity. But then there's a sticker on the oil door that says reference to the grade. So it's like it has temperatures, and then the just between this and this 80, this and this 100. Outlet. It must have no screens that can restrict flow to engine. That can restrict flow to engine. And B, outlet diameter. Outlet diameter must not be smaller than oil pump inlet. That makes sense, right? It does to me. Than oil pump inlet. I'm trying to figure out what to make this one. Well, if we made this some reason A, we talked all about the oil tank, then I can make this one B, I don't know why. I can call this the oil temp gauge. All right. Oil temp is taken. I think you have a lot of Q&A questions about where oil temp is taken. Is taken as oil enters the engine. All right, so you're gonna have all these oil pump questions, and the thing that really is going to get you through them all just fine is to realize that they're going to divide it up into two: wet sump, dry sump. All right, and so if you go talking wet sump, then we have to think about, well, the oil is all kind of integral, and they do not put the oil temp bulb down in the bottom where the oil is sitting in the sump. So what you want to know is where the oil temp is right before it gets into the engine. That's what's important. And the reason why they want to do that, we'll just say it this way, it's probably not true, but we got to think about pilots, right? So I am one, so I can talk about pilots. And who's pilots besides me and Steve and Harry? So, oh, that's right, and PK. Well, we'll divide the room into two. So there's pilots like PK and Harry, and then there's pilots like Steve and I, right? So, right. You know, these guys that fly our little 150s, right? So then you can look. So guys that fly 150s, not the brightest group in the
Yeah, I want to be in that group.
right, and so they, you know, when they build their airplanes, they don't want to scare guys like us because we're just not that bright. And so if we saw the oil temp getting too hot, we would panic, right? And then the poo would come out, right? And they don't want that, so they lie to us, right? So they want to tell us a little fib. So they want to make us feel better about everything. It's going to be fine. Don't worry. So the way they do that is they tell us the oil at its coolest point before it gets into the engine. But when it gets into the engine and it goes around the cylinders and the crankshaft and all the moving parts, what's going to happen to it? It's going to get a lot hotter, right? Well, they don't want to tell us about that. They just want to tell us, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Look at this gauge right here. It looks pretty, isn't it? It's a little low. So oil temp is taken as oil enters the engine, or we could put right after the pump. So after the pump.
That makes sense though,
Yeah,
because then you can tell if it's cooling. If it's pegged, then you know your engine oil's not cooling properly.
Okay, we could like that. I'm glad it made sense because I just made up that story. All right. As it enters the engine. So what is a good oil temp? Oil temp should be 575. I think it should be just a Celsius or Fahrenheit.
whatever floats your boat.
180 to 200 degrees F. That's what the oil temp should be. Now, what oil temp is that? In the engine, inlet, after it's what the gauge tells me. All right, so my oil temp gauge should read 180 to 200 with, and these are generic numbers because every manufacturer could be a little bit different, with the max red line of about 240. All right, why? Well, there's a couple of things. So I think I've told you this story, and I'll make it quick, but yes, I did. So the worst thing you can do to an engine in the wintertime is what?
Take off water before you can heat up. fly without cold oil?
Okay, well, all good. Well, let me tell you. So it used to be common. Maybe it still is. I just don't notice. Especially where I was out at Clarksburg. People who didn't know because it would get foggy out there in the winter time, and it's a grass runway right next to the river. And as the river water would come up during the when we used to get rain, you guys wouldn't remember that. You're too young. But water used to fall from the sky. And, I know, it sounds crazy. And the river would get really high. And in fact, they would actually have levee patrols looking for breaches and stuff. Well, over at Clarksburg, because we're right next to the levee, the far end of the runway, the west side of the runway, would start, the water would come out there. And so we would have less and less runway. You'd get to a point where it was just flooded down at that end. And it was grass. And so people around there, we couldn't fly a whole lot. And even over at Executive, the Thule fog would set in for days, weeks, months. So people aren't flying, but they love their aircraft. So what are they going to do? Well, I'm just going to go down and run it up real quick, right? So you get an airplane, you start it up, you just run it a little bit, and warm everything up, and then shut it down and go home. Well, what you're doing is, think about your engine. It's this case, this crankcase, right? And so there's all this air where your crankshaft is. You have your sump down below. So you start it up, and you warm up all of that air that's in the crankcase, and the oil gets a little bit warmer. And that air expands. The hot air expands, and it goes right out the breather. So you guys, because your engines are actually modified ground power units, most of them, you don't see that the breather for all the aircraft engines is just a big hole right up front with a little pipe that comes around. It runs just to kind of by the firewall and down. So you have this breather. So that's all it is. It just blows in. So the air expands, heats up, the hot air expanding goes out the breather. Then you shut down, and everything starts to cool and condense, and that air starts condensing. And so what does that condensed air inside the crankcase do? It needs more air, so it sucks it right up that tube, right back in, all that nice, fresh, wet air. And so what you do is you bring in a load of wet air, right? And so then it sits there, and it gets in the oil, the water goes into the oil, permeates everything. Then a couple days later, you come and do it again. Now you need a fresh load of wet air to come in. You get a fresh load of wet air, and it just repeats this process over and over. So they say, you should never just go out and run your aircraft up, right? You got to get the oil up to operating temperature. So if you can't run it, just leave it be. Some people used to say, well, then go by every few weeks and pull the propeller through a couple times. And they figure, well, what you're really doing at that point is you're wiping whatever oil was on the cylinders off. And so that was bad too. So they say the only good thing is just fly it. So. All right.
But after flying, you come and still this engine became cold and suck this.
Okay. So now, yes. So you want to fly it. Well, doesn't that do the same thing? Yes, it does. But if you get the oil up to at least 212 degrees, what happens to the water that is impregnated the oil? It boils out and cleans it all out. And so there you go. So your oil needs to get up to 212 degrees. But wait a minute. I just said 180 to 200.
That's at its coolest point.
So why is water going to boil out of that?
Because it's on the inlet.
Because it's on the inlet.
Yeah.
So how much hotter is the oil going to get? The thing that they don't want Steve and I to know because we get scared.
Hopefully not more than 240.
Engine adds about 50 degrees. So here's the boy, I tell you, if I did this once, I did it dozens of times, which is to say I did it dozens of times. This scenario would often play out with a customer calling up and saying, hey, do you guys do engine overhauls? Yes, I do. I think I might need an engine overhaul. Why do you think you might need that? Well, I'm having a real problem. The thing is just running so hot, I don't know what to do anymore. Well, the first thing is, we're going to get around to this, but it's worth pointing out right now. Engines are air-cooled, right? And they have this rubber seal that goes around the engine right here that is supposed to sit very tightly against the cowling and force air in the front of the aircraft, across and down the cylinders and out. I have seen, this is horrible. That's what this picture is representing. Absolutely awful, worn out. This is sagging down. All the air is just going to go through it. I think I got a picture of Yeah, it just gets uglier and uglier. Big air leaks right here with it coming through. Worn out. I know I have a picture of a really nice one. There, that's what it should. I mean, that's gorgeous. I found this picture. I'm like, ooh, that's beautiful. So this is beautiful baffling. It pushes really hard against the cowling. Like Jace, you were with me when I had to pull the cowling off. I was putting mine back on, and I made a comment, right? I said, yeah, it's not easy to get back on. If it was, that would be a problem. It's got to be hard. It's got to be pushing against that. So anyway, so people call and say, okay, so my oil temp's high. And I say, well, probably you just have worn out baffle seals. A lot of people never change them. They're neglected. And it's, no, actually, Kevin, let me tell you, I've had it to 4 mechanics. They've changed the baffling. They've changed the oil vernitherm valve. I've had the oil cooler taken off and sent out and flushed. I have done everything I can think of, and I still have high oil temperature. I cannot get this thing under control. Well, at that point, I'd say, why don't you bring it in? Let me take a look at it. And so they would leave it with me, and the first thing I would do is take the bulb out, the temperature bulb, and I told you this, right? And I would get oil, and I'd use a torch or something, but a coffee can full of oil. And I told you, right, with the coffee, yeah, with my wife's, that wasn't my wife's, this is my friend's wife. You bring in his candy thermometer, right? We calibrate it, and so we would look, and so a lot of oil temp gauges. Well, I'll make a square one. Oil temp gauges. They just look like this. It says oil temp, red, okay, and then the needle, of course, just is right in here. It's over here somewhere, but eventually it's gonna, right about here, maybe as they're running. And so I would make a card that would say OILTEMP and hand it to them. I'd say, well, when it's at the O, that's 100 degrees. And when it's in the I, that's 120. And the L would be 140. And I would just go through the whole thing and say, P is 180. And is that good or bad?
Good.
So if my customer's got his right here and it's at 180, what does that tell me? What should it get up to?
200.
Between 180 to 200 is where it should be. And he's thinking, well, shoot. So 200, and I would say red line, red, equals 200. Is there a problem there? No, because it could have got up to. So I'd have to call him up and say, we got a problem. Your oil's too cold. And then they would not be happy that they had spent all that money on oil, on all these fixes, when it was really looking at the wrong end of things. So
That's just somebody trying to make money.
no, actually it was well-meaning, well-intentioned mechanics who the customer probably did have baffle seals that were bad, which means high cylinder head temps that he wasn't finding out. And they saw that, and it did need replacing. After that, everything became a problem. The changing out the vernitherm valve, the oil cooler flush, all that stuff. That probably didn't need to be done. But just to say that I never trust those things. Okay. What is it? C. Pressure pump. Which is to say the oil pump. A little bit of review here. It is a gear-driven. Thank you. Gear-driven. What kind of? Positive or constant displacement. Displacement pump. We talked all about that. It, in fact, I know this isn't proper physics, but it's what we're doing anyway. Sucks oil from the tank. That was obvious. Things to think about. Leaks. Leaks in gaskets or any seams will suck air. That's not a good thing. So I'll put this. Remember, comma, the oil pressure gauge just reads pressure, which means it could be oil or it could be air. It doesn't care. It just reads pressure. So if you could somehow manage to get 60 psi of air in there, it'll tell you that. Yeah.
So, say for instance, you know where the suction tube mounts to the accessory housing.
I do know that.
How would you diagnose that? That that's where the, like, say the leak is there, how would you diagnose that that's where the leak is? Would you
Well-
have to pull it off and replace the gasket?
Yeah, one of the major problems you're going to have is I can't even think of a scenario right now where you're having this problem of oil and you wouldn't even know. You just don't necessarily know. Actually, I can start thinking it through. So you can start having problems with the propeller not working right. That'd be, I think that'd be the first thing I would notice if I was sucking air.
Constant speed.
Constant speed is starting to hunt. It's starting to wander back and forth, and the pilot would complain that the RPM is drastically moving back and forth. Then after that, when it gets really bad, fluctuations in oil pressure. Because honestly, the gauge is not going to be able to pump 60 psi of air. It just won't. It's not designed to do that. It'll have some air pressure, but you start seeing a fluctuation and having problems there. So yeah, at that point, I would probably start looking for really foamy oil in the tank, and then I would start looking for oil leaks. Well, on your Lycoming air leaks, it's going to be quite simple. You guys know there's only really two places you're going to get an air leak, right? On your engine. One is going to be that oil pickup tube. Two is going to be the pump body itself. That's it. So how do you get to that oil pickup tube? Well, on a Lycoming, to get anywhere in there, the first thing you have to do is take off all the intake pipes and all of the exhaust pipes, and you have to drop the oil sump. And from that point, you can see up in there to change out the oil pickup tube, which, by the way, you guys have the old style. The new styles, some of them, they're integral into the oil sump. And yours is set up for that. Now that you guys, how many people have put their oil, their accessory case on? And you notice when you put it on about eye level, because they're too tall, there's a big old, I think that's 3/8" pipe plug in there. All right, I don't have you take that out, because if you leave that out, you're going to hate your life. And we had some people leave those out a time or two. And but anyway, what that plug is, it's the optional pickup, where it would actually go align with the oil sump, and the oil sump had an integral going around. Yeah.
So this pressure pump is still under the required items, or?
No, I moved on. Sorry.
numbers to-
I probably could have made some. Well, pressure pump's pretty much a required item. Yeah, I don't think it mentions it.
I
So,
went from like numbers to.
yeah, I know. My thing all fell apart here. Sorry. Want me to make it a number?
No, no.
What number would I be on?
wanted to
I don't
be
care.
clear.
We'll just, okay, this will be star, and this will be circle, and this one's a square. That's what happens when it all falls apart.
Ever since the first day, I just use asterisk.
You know what happens, well, I'm not gonna blame, I sometimes put this stuff away and come back to it like months, years later, and I redo it, and Microsoft just doesn't want to format it if I start a new section right, and I never figure it out. Okay, so let me see, normal pressure. Normal pressure is 1, about 15 to 20 psi at idle, and about 16 to 115 psi. It depends on the engine too, at cruise. I don't know of any engine that goes up to 115, but that was in a book, so I think I just left it.
Would a dry sump engine have a higher oil pressure?
Same. So think about it. The pressure you want, and that's reading the pressure in the oil gallery, is the pressure that's being fed to the bearings, right? And so why the difference between idle and cruise? Well, quite honestly, that's just the best it can do it. At 15 to 20 is the best it can do at idle. So if I had an aircraft engine and I built it, did I say 60? Yeah, 60. I'm sorry, 60.
That makes more sense.
60. Yeah, even when I looked at what I just wrote. Sorry. So 60. So if I built an engine and I started it up and at idle it was giving me 40 psi of oil pressure at idle, what am I going to do about it? Not a dang thing. I'm happy about that. There is nothing wrong with that. That's good. If I can get 60 psi at idle, great. I'm totally happy with that. But what happens is the engine starts to wear, the pump wears, the engine wears, the spaces get bigger. So what happens is that oil pressure starts dropping off at idle because the pump just isn't moving fast enough to do anything better than that. So the oil pressure relief ball is on its seat, and the pump is doing the best it can, and all it's getting is 15 to 20. But when you start to bring up the power, bring up the speed of the engine, and the oil pump gears start turning faster, you start filling up the oil galleries, filling everything up, and then the oil pressure balls is going to start coming off its seat and regulating and holding it at 60 to whatever you put. 60, 75 seems more normal to me than 115, but that was the number I got here. So let's see. A couple more points before we move on. Oil travels around or through the middle?
Around.
All right, so we'll put outside. Outside? No, we'll put around. Around sounds better. Around. Not through the gears. So around the outside. And of course the pump is designed to pump more oil than the engine needs. Needs or / can handle. And now we'll take a break.